Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time, a gentle exploration into the shadows and complexities of medieval kingship. As you settle into your comfortable space tonight, allow yourself to drift back with me, back nearly 1,000 years, to an age of stone castles and flickering torchlight, where the weight of a crown carried burdens far heavier than gold. Tonight, we'll slowly uncover the hidden truths behind the gilded facade of medieval royalty. You might imagine kings as powerful, wealthy, and free. But as we'll discover together, the reality was often quite different. So take a deep breath. Let your shoulders relax and prepare to see the medieval world through the weary eyes of those who wore the crown. Picture, if you will, the year 1216. The morning mist clings to the Thames as King John of England awakens in his chamber at Newark Castle. The heavy wooden shutters filter pale October light across stone walls that seem to press inward with the weight of responsibility. John's sleep has been restless again, haunted not by dreams of glory, but by the constant gnawing anxiety that came with ruling a fractured kingdom. This is where our story truly begins. In the quiet moments before dawn, when even kings must face their deepest fears. Let us start by gently exploring what it truly meant to inherit a medieval crown. Imagine yourself born into the highest nobility, destined from your first breath to one-day rule. You might think this sounds like a blessing, but consider the reality that awaited these royal children. From the moment a future king drew breath, his life was no longer his own. Every decision, every friendship, every meal was scrutinized and planned by others. Picture a young prince, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, sitting rigidly through hours of Latin lessons, learning not just language, but the complex art of diplomacy. His small hands would ache from gripping quills as he practiced writing treaties he couldn't yet understand. While outside his window, other children played freely in castle courtyards. The education of a medieval king was relentless and all-consuming. Let your mind wander to those long, cold mornings in stone chambers where young princes learned statecraft. They studied not just languages and mathematics, but the delicate balance of keeping nobles happy while maintaining royal authority. They memorized genealogies, stretching back generations, understanding that every marriage alliance, every land grant, every title carried political weight that could strengthen or destroy their future reign. But perhaps most challenging of all was learning to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval politics. Imagine sitting in council meetings as a teenager, listening to grizzled advisors debate matters of war and peace, knowing that someday these life-and-death decisions would rest entirely on your shoulders. The pressure was immense, constant, and began before these future kings had even learned to shave. Let us drift now to the coronation ceremony itself. That moment when a prince becomes a king, when the weight of responsibility settles like a heavy cloak across young shoulders. Picture Westminster Abbey in the year 1189, as Richard I prepares for his coronation. The great stone walls echo with chanted prayers, and hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows across ancient columns. But even in this moment of triumph, observe the subtle signs of the burden to come. Richard's hands tremble slightly as the crown is placed upon his head, not from excitement, but from the dawning realization of what this moment truly means. The cheering crowds outside represent millions of people whose lives now depend on his decisions. Every choice he makes will ripple outward, affecting harvests and harvests to come, determining who lives and who dies in battles yet unfought. The coronation feast that follows is magnificent, yet notice how the new king barely touches his food. His eyes constantly scan the great hall, watching for signs of discontent among his nobles, mentally cataloguing who seems pleased and who appears to be plotting. Even in celebration, a medieval king could never truly relax. Now let's gently explore the daily reality of medieval kingship, beginning with something as simple as waking each morning. Picture yourself as King Henry III, opening your eyes in the pre-dawn darkness of your royal chamber. But this is no peaceful awakening. Before you've even fully emerged from sleep, courtiers are already gathered outside your door, waiting with urgent matters that cannot wait for your convenience. Your first responsibility each day is not to yourself, but to your kingdom. Before you can eat, before you can even dress in private, you must receive reports from across your realm. Messengers arrive mud-splattered and exhausted, bearing news of potential rebellions, failed harvests, or threats from neighboring kingdoms. Each piece of news requires immediate attention, immediate decisions that could affect thousands of lives. Imagine the mental exhaustion of processing such information before dawn has even broken. Your mind must be sharp enough to distinguish between genuine threats and political maneuvering, wise enough to see through the careful words of nobles who present their own interests as the kingdom's needs. There is no time for the luxury of slow awakening, no gentle transition from sleep to consciousness. The medieval king's breakfast table becomes a council chamber, where even the simple act of eating is interrupted by urgent consultations. Picture trying to enjoy a piece of bread while simultaneously deciding whether to raise taxes to fund a defensive war, or listening to reports of plague spreading through your eastern provinces. Every bite is taken between weighty decisions, every sip of wine accompanied by the knowledge that your choices will echo through history. Let us move slowly through the king's morning routine, observing how even the most basic activities become instruments of statecraft. The king's choice of clothing, for instance, was never merely personal preference. Each garment, each piece of jewelry, each accessory sent carefully calculated messages to those who would see him throughout the day. Picture the royal wardrobe, filled with magnificent robes and ceremonial regalia. But consider the weight of these garments, not just their physical heft, but their symbolic burden. A king could not simply choose to dress comfortably on a difficult day. His appearance had to project strength even when he felt weak, confidence even when doubt gnawed at his thoughts, prosperity even when the royal treasury ran dangerously low. The act of dressing becomes a daily performance, with servants helping to arrange every fold of fabric to convey the right impression. The king must stand still and patient while this elaborate costume is assembled, all the while his mind racing through the day's challenges ahead. Even this private moment is witnessed by numerous attendants, each watching for signs of the king's mood, each ready to carry gossip about the royal temperament to corners of the court where such intelligence might be valuable. Now let's drift deeper into the heart of medieval kingship, the crushing weight of decision-making that never ceased. Picture yourself in the great hall of a 12th century castle where King John holds court. The massive stone chamber echoes with voices as petitioners line up, each seeking royal judgment on matters that seem overwhelming in their complexity and consequence. Before you stands a merchant whose trading caravan was attacked by bandits near the Scottish border. He seeks compensation and justice, but granting his request might strain relations with Scottish nobles who claim those lands. Behind him waits a widow whose husband died in royal service, deserving of pension but adding to an already strained treasury. Next comes a bishop complaining of knights who refuse to respect church sanctuary, requiring delicate navigation between secular and religious authority. Each case demands not just a decision, but the right decision, one that upholds justice while maintaining political stability, satisfies immediate needs while considering long-term consequences. The king must weigh every word carefully, knowing that his judgments will be scrutinized, criticized, and remembered. A single poorly considered ruling could spark rebellion or create precedents that haunt the kingdom for generations. Imagine the mental fatigue of rendering such judgments hour after hour, day after day, year after year. The king's mind must remain sharp and fair, even as it grows weary, must show wisdom even when presented with problems that have no good solutions. The weight of these decisions accumulates like stones in a sack, growing heavier with each passing year of reign. Between these formal court sessions, the king faces an endless stream of private consultations with advisors, each bringing their own agenda disguised as counsel for the realm's good. Picture the royal solar, a private chamber where the king might hope for a moment's peace, instead filled with hushed conversations about potential threats and opportunities. Lords whisper about their neighbors' suspicious activities. Bishops report concerning sermons from rival clergy. Merchants share intelligence gathered from their travels. The king must listen to all of this, evaluating each piece of information for truth, relevance, and hidden meaning. Advisors speak in careful language, rarely stating their true intentions directly. The king becomes expert at reading between lines, at understanding what is not said as much as what is. This constant vigilance is exhausting, transforming even friendly conversations into exercises in political calculation. Let us pause here to consider the profound loneliness that accompanied medieval kingship. Picture the king at his evening meal, seated at the high table before hundreds of courtiers. Despite being surrounded by people, he dines in essential solitude. Every smile directed toward him might hide ulterior motives. Every friendly word could mask political calculation. Every laugh might conceal mockery or conspiracy. The king cannot confide his true thoughts to those around him, cannot share his fears or doubts without appearing weak. Even his closest advisors are ultimately subjects who might use royal vulnerability for their own advancement. The crown becomes a barrier between the king and genuine human connection, creating an isolation that grows more profound with each year of rule. Consider the relationships that most people take for granted. Friendships based on mutual affection rather than political advantage. Conversations where words can be spoken without careful consideration of their implications. Moments of genuine laughter and relaxation. For the medieval king, such simple pleasures become increasingly rare and precious, remembered longingly from childhood days before the crown claimed his life entirely. Even within his own family, the king faced unique challenges that made authentic relationships difficult. Royal marriages were political alliances first, personal relationships second. Picture a king meeting his bride for the first time on their wedding day, knowing that their union was designed to secure peace treaties or trade agreements rather than personal happiness. The pressure to produce male heirs added another layer of complexity to these already strained relationships. The king's children, too, became political assets rather than simply beloved offspring. Sons represented both hope for dynastic continuation and potential threats to current power. History was filled with royal fathers who faced rebellions led by their own ambitious heirs. Daughters became valuable bargaining chips in marriage negotiations, their personal desires subordinated to diplomatic necessity. Even the most loving royal parent could never escape the political implications of every family decision. Let's explore now the constant gnawing fear that shadowed every medieval king, the knowledge that his power rested on an impossibly delicate balance that could be upset at any moment. Picture King Stephen in the winter of 1139, pacing the cold stone floors of his castle as reports arrive of his cousin Matilda's growing support for her claim to the throne. Every friendly lord might secretly be negotiating with potential usurpers. Every peaceful province might be preparing for rebellion. The king's security depended not on loyalty born of affection, but on the complex calculus of self-interest among his nobles. Lords supported the crown as long as it served their purposes, but medieval history was littered with examples of how quickly allegiances could shift when circumstances changed. The king lived with the constant awareness that his throne was only as secure as his ability to keep his nobles satisfied, his kingdom prosperous, and his enemies at bay. This insecurity manifested in sleepless nights spent reviewing intelligence reports, morning audiences devoted to assessing the loyalty of provincial governors, afternoon meetings with spy masters who brought whispers of potential plots. The king's mind could never rest, always calculating threats, always preparing for challenges that might emerge from any direction. Even celebrations and festivals became occasions for vigilance rather than joy, as large gatherings provided opportunities for conspirators to meet and plan. Consider the psychological toll of living under such constant threat. The king developed habits of suspicion that poisoned even innocent interactions. A lord's late arrival at court might signal disrespect or rebellion rather than simple travel delays. A merchant's nervous behavior could indicate economic plotting rather than natural anxiety in royal presence. The king's world became populated by potential enemies, making genuine trust nearly impossible to maintain. The physical demands of medieval kingship were equally exhausting. Picture the king in full armor, leading his troops into battle not because he chose glory, but because medieval warfare demanded personal royal presence. Kings who failed to appear on battlefields quickly lost the respect of their warrior nobility, but battlefield leadership exposed them to very real dangers that could end dynasties in a single moment. Even when not actively campaigning, the king maintained a punishing schedule of travel throughout his realm. Medieval kingdoms were vast territories that required constant royal presence to maintain control. Imagine months spent on horseback, moving from castle to castle, sleeping in different beds, eating unfamiliar food, always performing the role of confident ruler, even when exhausted by constant motion. These royal progresses served multiple purposes. They allowed the king to assess local conditions personally, demonstrated royal power to distant provinces, and provided opportunities for subjects to present petitions directly to their monarch. But they also subjected the king to primitive travel conditions, uncomfortable accommodations, and the constant strain of public performance in unfamiliar surroundings. The king's retinue traveled with him like a mobile court, but coordinating such movements required enormous logistical effort. Hundreds of courtiers, guards, servants, and animals moved across medieval roads that were often little more than muddy tracks. The king could not simply decide to change his route or extend his stay. Every movement had been planned weeks in advance, involving complex arrangements for food, lodging, and security. Let us consider now the economic pressures that constantly plagued medieval kings. Picture the royal treasurer presenting his accounts to King Henry III, his face grave as he explains that royal expenses far exceed royal income. The king's court was expected to display magnificent wealth as a symbol of royal power, but maintaining such displays required resources that often simply did not exist. Medieval royal finances were precarious at best. Income came primarily from royal lands, feudal obligations, and various taxes that were difficult to collect and politically dangerous to increase. Expenses, however, seemed unlimited. Court maintenance, military campaigns, diplomatic gifts, infrastructure projects, and the constant demands of noble rewards and ecclesiastical donations. The gap between income and expenses created chronic financial stress that influenced every royal decision. Kings often resorted to creative financing that created additional problems. Borrowing from wealthy merchants or foreign bankers provided temporary relief, but created long-term obligations that constrained future actions. Selling royal lands generated immediate income but reduced future revenue sources. Increasing taxes might fill royal coffers, but could also provoke rebellions that cost far more than the additional revenue provided. The king found himself constantly balancing immediate needs against long-term consequences, short-term political stability against fiscal responsibility. Every expenditure became a political decision, Choosing to fund military campaigns might prevent foreign invasion, but could also bankrupt the realm and provoke domestic rebellion. The weight of these financial decisions added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming burden of responsibility. Picture the king late at night in his private chamber, scrolling through ledgers by candlelight, trying to find resources for urgent needs while keeping the kingdom financially stable. The numbers never seemed to balance, the demands always exceeded the available resources, and the consequences of fiscal failure could include loss of throne, kingdom, and life itself. Religious obligations added yet another dimension to the medieval king's burden. Picture King John kneeling in Winchester Cathedral, outwardly performing his Christian duties while inwardly calculating the political implications of every religious gesture. Medieval kingship was believed to be divinely ordained, making the king God's representative on earth. But this sacred role created obligations and expectations that were often impossible to fulfill. The king was expected to be a model Christian while simultaneously making decisions that required very unchristian calculations. He must show mercy while maintaining justice, demonstrate humility while projecting strength, forgive enemies while protecting his kingdom from their future attacks. These contradictions created internal conflicts that had no easy resolution. Relationships with church authorities required constant diplomatic finesse. Bishops and abbots possessed independent power bases that could support or challenge royal authority, depending on how well the king managed ecclesiastical politics. Religious disputes could escalate into political crises that threatened the stability of the entire realm, as King John discovered during his conflict with Pope Innocent III. The king's personal faith, whatever its genuine nature, became subordinated to political necessity. Religious observances became public performances designed to demonstrate royal piety to subjects who expected their monarch to embody Christian virtue. Private moments of doubt or spiritual struggle could not be acknowledged without appearing weak or illegitimate in the eyes of a deeply religious society. Even the king's death was not entirely his own. Picture the elaborate funeral preparations that began long before a medieval king's actual demise, the complex protocols that governed royal succession, the political maneuvering that began the moment a king showed signs of failing health. The king's final illness became a matter of state concern rather than simply personal suffering. Royal deathbeds were crowded with nobles, clergy, and courtiers who came not primarily to offer comfort, but to position themselves advantageously for the coming transition. The dying king's words were carefully recorded for their political implications, his final decisions scrutinized for their impact on future stability. Even in death, the king remained primarily a political figure rather than simply a human being facing mortality. The uncertainty surrounding succession added urgency to these deathbed scenes. If the king died without clear arrangements for orderly transition, civil war might follow immediately. The dying monarch's last acts often involved desperate attempts to secure his kingdom's future stability, making final arrangements that he hoped would prevent the chaos that so often followed royal deaths. But let us step back now from these heavy responsibilities and consider the small human moments that revealed the personal cost of medieval kingship. Picture King Henry II alone in his chamber after learning of his son's rebellion, staring out at the castle walls that had become more prison than palace. In such moments, the crown's weight became unbearable, not because of gold and jewels, but because of the isolation and betrayal that accompanied royal power. These private moments of vulnerability were carefully hidden from public view, but they accumulated over years of reign, creating deep wells of loneliness and regret. The king might remember simpler times before his coronation, when choices were personal rather than political, when relationships were based on affection rather than advantage. Such memories became both treasured and painful, reminders of a life that could never be reclaimed. The king's awareness of his own mortality took on unique dimensions. Unlike ordinary men who might hope to be remembered fondly by family and friends, kings knew they would be judged by history for their political successes and failures. Personal virtues and private kindnesses would be forgotten, while public mistakes would be recorded and criticized for centuries. This knowledge added poignancy to every decision, every relationship, every quiet moment of reflection. Consider the profound irony of medieval kingship. Those who possessed the most power were often the least free to use it as they wished. Every royal desire had to be weighed against political consequences, every personal preference subjected to public scrutiny. The king's life became a performance where authenticity was not just impossible, but potentially dangerous. Picture King John in his final days, weakened by illness and racked by the knowledge that his reign had brought more chaos than prosperity to his kingdom. The crown that once symbolized divine authority now felt like a burden too heavy to bear, but one that could never be set aside. Even dying, he remained trapped within the role that had consumed his entire adult life. The king's legacy was never truly his own to shape. History would be written by survivors who had their own political motives for portraying royal reigns in particular ways. Enemies would emphasize failures and weaknesses, allies would exaggerate successes and virtues. But the king's own understanding of his reign, his private struggles, good intentions gone wrong, impossible choices forced by circumstances, would likely be lost forever. As we near the end of our gentle journey through the shadows of medieval kingship, let us take a moment to reflect on what we have discovered together. The crown that seemed so golden from a distance revealed itself to be forged from responsibilities too heavy for any mortal to bear comfortably. The throne that appeared to offer unlimited power instead became a prison that constrained every aspect of its occupant's life. These medieval kings, despite their wealth and authority, lived lives of constant stress, profound isolation, and crushing responsibility. Their days were filled with decisions that could determine the fate of thousands, their nights haunted by the knowledge that every choice carried enormous consequences. They were expected to be perfect Christian rulers while navigating political realities that often demanded very un-Christian calculations. The kingdoms they inherited were not prizes to be enjoyed, but burdens to be carried, puzzles to be solved, legacies to be preserved and passed on intact. Success was measured not by personal happiness, but by political stability, military victory, and dynastic continuation. Failure could mean not just personal downfall, but the collapse of entire realms and the suffering of countless subjects. Yet in understanding these burdens, we gain insight into the human cost of power, the price paid by those who seem to have everything but actually possess very little freedom to live authentic lives. The medieval king story reminds us that positions of ultimate authority often demand the sacrifice of simple human pleasures that ordinary people take for granted. As you settle deeper into rest tonight, carry with you this gentle understanding of how the weight of responsibility can transform golden crowns into burdens heavier than stone. Let the knowledge of these long-ago struggles remind you to appreciate the freedom you possess, to make choices based on personal desire rather than political necessity, to form relationships based on genuine affection rather than strategic advantage. The stone castles where these kings once lay awake with worry have crumbled into romantic ruins. Their political struggles faded into historical curiosity. But the essential human experiences they endured, loneliness, responsibility, the weight of others' expectations, remain timeless reminders of the complexity of leadership and the precious value of authentic freedom. Sleep now with the gentle understanding that power and happiness are not synonymous, that the most enviable positions often exact the highest personal costs. Let the stories of these medieval kings drift through your dreams like distant echoes, reminding you that every crown casts shadows, and sometimes the heaviest burdens are worn by those who seem to have everything. Rest easy, knowing that your choices are your own, your relationships genuine, your burdens lighter than those carried by the kings and queens of ages past. The medieval world fades into peaceful memory, leaving you free to dream of simpler times and gentler responsibilities, carried safely into sleep by the whispered stories of crowns too heavy for mortal heads to bear. Let us drift now into the deeper currents of medieval royal life, exploring the intricate web of relationships that bound these kings in golden chains. Picture the court of King Louis VII of France, where every smile concealed calculation, every gesture carried political weight, and every conversation became an exercise in diplomatic chess. The medieval court was a world unto itself, a complex ecosystem where hundreds of nobles, clerks, servants, and hangers-on competed for royal favor. Imagine walking through the great halls of the Louvre in the 12th century, where the air hummed with whispered conversations and barely concealed ambitions. Every person present served multiple masters, their king, their family interests, their regional loyalties, and their personal advancement. For the king at the center of this web, every interaction required careful navigation. A moment's favoritism shown to one noble could spark jealousy in a dozen others. A casual comment might be interpreted as royal policy and spread throughout the kingdom before sunset. The king learned to speak in measured phrases, to smile without warmth, to listen without revealing his thoughts. Consider the exhausting mental exercise of remembering not just names and faces among hundreds of courtiers, but also their family connections, regional interests, historical grievances, and current ambitions. The king's mind became a vast library of political intelligence, constantly updated and cross-referenced. Forgetting a minor noble's recent loss of lands could create an enemy. Failing to acknowledge a young knight's battlefield valor could lose a valuable ally. The royal dining hall exemplified these complex dynamics. Picture the elaborate seating arrangements that required royal attention to matters of precedence, family honor, and political alliances. Who sat where at the high table sent messages that reverberated throughout the kingdom. A merchant elevated above his usual station might signal new royal policies toward trade. A bishop moved farther from the king's side could indicate shifting religious politics. Even the king's meals became political theater. Every dish served, every cup of wine offered, every gesture of royal attention was observed and interpreted by dozens of watching eyes. The king could not simply eat when hungry or drink when thirsty. He must consider the symbolic implications of accepting food from particular nobles, the message sent by praising certain dishes, the political meaning of sharing his wine with specific guests. Between these formal occasions, the king faced an endless parade of private audiences, each petitioner bringing requests that seemed reasonable individually but created impossible conflicts when considered together. Picture the royal solar, filled with supplicants, each believing their cause deserved special consideration, each unable to understand why their obviously just request could not be granted immediately. A lord requests permission to marry his daughter to a neighboring family, strengthening his regional position but potentially threatening the balance of power the king has carefully maintained. A merchant guild seeks exclusive trading rights that would boost royal revenues but might provoke retaliation from competing cities. Church officials request royal support for new monasteries that would demonstrate piety but strain royal finances already stretched thin by military needs. The king must weigh each request, not just on its individual merits, but against its impact on dozens of other decisions, relationships, and commitments. What appears to be a simple favor often creates ripple effects that influence relationships throughout the kingdom. The king's reputation for fairness and wisdom depends on finding solutions that satisfy immediate needs while preserving long-term stability. Let us explore now the medieval king's relationship with warfare, that constant shadow that darkened even the most peaceful reigns. Picture King Richard the Firm, preparing for the Third Crusade, knowing that military glory was expected of him, yet understanding that prolonged absence from England could destabilize his kingdom and provide opportunities for ambitious nobles to challenge royal authority. Medieval kingship was inherently military in nature. Kings who avoided warfare were seen as weak, but kings who campaigned too frequently risked losing control of domestic politics. This created an impossible balance. The king needed military success to maintain prestige and deter challengers, but military campaigns drained resources, exposed the kingdom to external threats, and provided opportunities for internal rebellion. The physical demands of medieval warfare were extraordinary. Picture the king donning 60 pounds of armor, mounting a war horse, and leading charges into enemy lines, where a single unlucky blow could end not just his life, but his entire dynasty. Kings were expected to fight personally, to demonstrate courage under fire, to inspire their troops through personal example. This was not ceremonial leadership, but actual combat where royal blood might water foreign battlefields. But the psychological burden was perhaps even greater than the physical danger. Every military decision carried enormous moral weight. The king's choice to besiege a particular castle might condemn hundreds of innocent civilians to starvation. His decision to retreat from a losing battle might save his army, but could be interpreted as cowardice that undermined his entire reign. Victory required ruthless calculations about acceptable losses, while defeat could trigger political collapse at home. Consider the loneliness of making such decisions. The king might consult with military advisors, but ultimately, the responsibility for life and death choices rested entirely on his shoulders. He must order men to die for causes that served political necessity rather than simple justice, must calculate the value of human lives against strategic objectives, must maintain the appearance of confidence even when doubt gnawed at his conscience. The aftermath of battles brought no relief from these burdens. Victory required decisions about prisoners, conquered territories, and distribution of spoils that satisfied military supporters while maintaining diplomatic relationships with other kingdoms. Defeat meant not just military consequences, but political repercussions that could destabilize the entire realm. Between active campaigns, the king lived with constant awareness that warfare might resume at any moment. Intelligence networks brought daily reports of potential threats. Military advisors presented plans for various contingencies. Diplomatic correspondence carried subtle threats disguised as friendly communications. Peace was never truly peaceful for a medieval king. It was simply preparation for the next inevitable conflict. Let us turn now to examine the medieval king's relationship with the church, that powerful institution that could either legitimize or destroy royal authority. Picture King Henry II kneeling in penance at Canterbury Cathedral, performing public humiliation to atone for his role in Thomas Becket's murder. This scene illustrates the complex dance between secular and religious power that dominated medieval politics. The church possessed independent sources of authority that could challenge royal power. Bishops controlled vast territories, commanded significant military resources, and claimed allegiance to the Pope rather than earthly kings. Religious law often conflicted with royal justice, creating jurisdictional disputes that required careful navigation to avoid triggering larger conflicts between church and state. Kings needed ecclesiastical support to maintain legitimacy, coronation ceremonies, religious endorsement of royal policies, and priestly teachings about divine right to rule all reinforced royal authority. But this dependence came at a cost. Religious leaders expected royal protection of church interests, generous donations to religious institutions, and royal enforcement of church law, even when it conflicted with secular needs. The king's personal faith became subordinated to political calculation. Religious observances were public performances designed to demonstrate royal piety. But genuine spiritual experiences became nearly impossible in the glare of constant political scrutiny. The king might long for moments of authentic religious contemplation, but even his prayers were analyzed for their political implications by those who observed his every gesture. Relationships with individual religious leaders required the same careful management as secular politics. A bishop's theological positions might influence royal policy. An abbot's financial practices might affect royal revenues. A popular preacher's sermons might shape public opinion about royal decisions. The king must monitor religious politics as carefully as secular affairs, understanding that spiritual authority could be wielded as effectively as military force. Consider the exhausting complexity of managing relationships with the papacy while maintaining royal independence. Medieval popes claimed ultimate authority over Christian kings, demanding obedience in matters they considered religious, but which often had profound political implications. Marriage annulments, ecclesiastical appointments, and religious taxes all created potential conflicts between papal wishes and royal needs. The king found himself caught between local church leaders who expected royal support for their regional interests and papal representatives who demanded compliance with Rome's broader agenda. Satisfying one group often meant alienating the other, creating religious tensions that could escalate into political crises, threatening the stability of the entire kingdom. Now let us explore the medieval king's domestic life, that private realm that was never truly private for those who wore the crown. Picture the royal nursery, where future kings learned their first lessons in the performance of power, where childhood games became training exercises in political manipulation, where family relationships were shaped by dynastic necessity rather than natural affection. Royal marriages were diplomatic treaties made flesh, unions designed to secure alliances, prevent wars, or claim disputed territories. The king's choice of bride was never personal preference, but political calculation that affected the balance of power throughout Europe. Consider the loneliness of wedding a stranger whose primary value lay in her family connections rather than her personal qualities. These arranged marriages often produced relationships of mutual respect, but rarely the deep emotional connection that sustains most couples through life's challenges. The king and queen might share a bed and produce heirs together, but they remained essentially political partners rather than intimate companions. Each spouse served the other's interests while pursuing their own family's agenda, creating households filled with careful courtesy but little genuine warmth. The birth of royal children brought joy, mixed with immediate political calculation. Sons represented hope for dynastic continuation, but also potential threats to current power. History was filled with examples of royal heirs who rebelled against their fathers, either from personal ambition or political manipulation by noble factions seeking to use princely discontent for their own purposes. Daughters became valuable diplomatic assets whose marriages could secure crucial alliances, but their personal desires were completely subordinated to political necessity. A royal princess might be betrothed in childhood to foreign princes she would never meet until her wedding day, spending her youth learning languages and customs of kingdoms she was destined to rule as queen, but never truly call home. The king's relationship with his children was inevitably shaped by these political realities. Natural paternal affection competed with dynastic planning, spontaneous family moments became rare luxuries in schedules dominated by state business. Even intimate family conversations carried political implications. A father's casual comment about neighboring kingdoms might influence his son's future policies. A daughter's expressed preferences about marriage partners might complicate diplomatic negotiations. Royal households were never private retreats, but rather extensions of the court, filled with servants, tutors, advisors, and guests who observed and reported on every aspect of royal family life. The king could not simply relax with his children or share intimate moments with his wife without considering how their private behavior might be interpreted and used by political rivals. Consider the profound sadness of royal parents who watched their children transformed by the same pressures that had consumed their own lives. They understood better than anyone the burdens that awaited young princes and princesses. Yet they were powerless to spare their offspring the weight of the crown that would someday descend upon the next generation. Let us drift now toward the financial labyrinth that entangled every medieval king, a maze of obligations, expectations, and shortfalls that turned royal treasuries into sources of constant anxiety rather than security. Picture the royal counting house, where scribes worked by candlelight, their ledgers filled with columns of numbers that never seemed to balance, expenses that always exceeded income, debts that grew larger with each passing year. Medieval royal finances were precarious at best, dependent on sources of revenue that fluctuated wildly with weather, warfare, and political stability. Royal income came primarily from crown lands that might produce abundant harvests or devastating crop failures, depending on conditions beyond any king's control. Feudal obligations provided military service and limited financial support, but these traditional arrangements were often insufficient to meet the growing costs of medieval government. The king's court was expected to display magnificent wealth as a symbol of royal power and divine blessing, but maintaining such displays required enormous expenditures that strained even the richest kingdoms. Royal feasts, ceremonial robes, architectural projects, and diplomatic gifts all served important political purposes, but their costs accumulated relentlessly in treasuries that were often nearly empty. Military campaigns created particularly severe financial pressures. Picture the enormous costs of equipping armies, purchasing supplies, transporting troops across vast distances, and compensating soldiers and mercenaries whose loyalty depended on regular payment. Victory might bring spoils that temporarily eased financial pressures, but defeat could bankrupt entire kingdoms while leaving them vulnerable to further attacks. The king found himself constantly choosing between immediate needs and long-term financial stability. Borrowing from wealthy merchants or foreign banks provided temporary relief, but created interest obligations that compounded over time. Selling crown lands generated immediate income, but reduced future revenue sources. Raising taxes might fill royal coffers, but could also provoke rebellions that cost far more than the additional revenue provided. These financial pressures influenced every aspect of royal decision-making. Military campaigns had to be planned around available resources rather than strategic necessity. Diplomatic gifts were carefully calculated to maintain relationships without bankrupting the treasury. Even charitable donations and religious endowments became political calculations rather than expressions of genuine piety. The king's personal expenses were scrutinized as carefully as state expenditures. Royal clothing, food, entertainment, and travel all carried political implications that required significant financial investment. The king could not appear impoverished without undermining confidence in royal authority, but excessive display might provoke criticism about fiscal irresponsibility during times of general hardship. Picture the lonely hours the king spent reviewing financial accounts, trying to find resources for urgent needs while keeping the kingdom solvent. Treasury officials presented their reports with barely concealed anxiety, knowing that every request for additional funding might be impossible to fulfill. The weight of financial responsibility added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming burden of leadership. As we continue our gentle journey through the shadows of medieval kingship, let us explore the king's relationship with justice, that fundamental responsibility that transformed him from mere political leader into ultimate arbiter of right and wrong throughout his realm. Picture the Great Hall of Winchester Castle, where King Arthur's legendary Round Table still hangs, but imagine instead the reality of royal justice, complex, imperfect, and burdened with consequences that no mortal wisdom could fully anticipate. Medieval kings served as the final court of appeal for all legal disputes within their kingdoms, a responsibility that required Solomon-like wisdom, but offered only human understanding. Every day brought cases that tested the limits of royal judgment, disputes between nobles that could escalate into civil war if handled poorly, conflicts between church and secular law that could destabilize relationships with Rome, criminal cases where evidence was uncertain but royal decision was final. The king must become expert in multiple legal traditions that often contradicted each other. Roman law, Germanic customs, church canon, and local traditions all claimed authority over different aspects of medieval life. Navigating these competing legal systems required not just knowledge, but political wisdom to understand which precedents could be safely ignored and which must be upheld to maintain social stability. Consider the moral weight of capital punishment decisions that could not be delegated to subordinates. The king's judgment meant life or death for accused criminals, but medieval evidence was often fragmentary and unreliable. Witnesses might lie for personal advantage, confessions could be obtained through torture, and social prejudices influenced every aspect of legal proceedings. Yet the king must render final judgment, knowing that innocent people might die because of his decisions. Property disputes created equally complex challenges that carried long-term political consequences. Land ownership in medieval society determined not just wealth, but political power, military obligations, and social status. Royal decisions about disputed inheritances, contested boundaries, and feudal obligations affected entire family dynasties and regional power structures. A single poorly considered judgment could destabilize relationships among noble families for generations. The king's reputation for justice became crucial to maintaining legitimate authority throughout his realm. Subjects who believed royal judgment was fair and impartial supported the crown even during difficult times, but perceptions of judicial corruption or favoritism could spark rebellions that threatened dynastic survival. Every legal decision became a test of royal character that would be remembered and evaluated by future generations. Yet achieving perfect justice was impossible within the constraints of medieval society. Political necessity often conflicted with legal precedent. Maintaining stability sometimes required overlooking technically illegal behavior by powerful nobles, and royal survival occasionally demanded decisions that served political expediency rather than abstract justice. The king lived with the knowledge that his judicial legacy would be evaluated by standards he could never fully meet. Picture the king late at night in his private chamber, reviewing legal documents by candlelight, trying to understand complex disputes that had no clear resolution. Legal advisors offered their opinions, but ultimate responsibility rested with the crown. The king must choose between competing claims to justice, knowing that his decision would create precedents affecting similar cases for years to come. The emotional toll of these judicial responsibilities was enormous, but could never be publicly acknowledged. The king might feel genuine anguish about condemning criminals to death, deep uncertainty about complex property disputes, or moral distress about legal decisions that served political necessity rather than pure justice. But such doubts had to remain private, hidden behind the confident facade required of royal authority. Now let us explore the medieval king's relationship with his nobility, that complex web of obligations, privileges, and potential threats that shaped every aspect of royal policy. Picture the great council chamber where King John met with his barons before Runnymede, the tension palpable as both sides maneuvered for advantage in negotiations that would determine the future balance of power between crown and nobility. Medieval nobility possessed independent sources of power that could either support or challenge royal authority, depending on how skillfully the king managed these crucial relationships. Great lords controlled vast territories, commanded significant military forces, and maintained their own networks of alliances that extended throughout Europe. They served the crown by feudal obligation, but retained the power to withdraw their support if royal policies threatened their interests. The king walked a constant tightrope between asserting royal authority and respecting noble privileges. Too much royal control sparked rebellions by lords who felt their traditional rights were being violated. Too little central authority allowed noble conflicts to escalate into private wars that destabilized entire regions. Finding the proper balance required political wisdom that few kings possessed, and even fewer could maintain consistently throughout their reigns. Noble assemblies became exercises in diplomatic complexity, where every word carried multiple meanings and every gesture was analyzed for political significance. The king must appear strong enough to command respect, while remaining flexible enough to accommodate legitimate noble concerns. He needed noble support for military campaigns and tax collection, but providing sufficient incentives to secure this cooperation often meant granting concessions that weakened long-term royal authority. Regional power structures added another layer of complexity to these relationships. Northern lords might have different interests than southern nobles. Border regions required different policies than central territories, and coastal areas faced challenges unknown to inland provinces. The king must understand these regional variations while maintaining consistent royal policies that did not appear to favor particular areas at the expense of others. Marriage politics among noble families created constantly shifting alliance patterns that required careful royal monitoring. A wedding between two great houses might unite their territories in ways that threatened royal control, while a family feud could destabilize entire regions if not carefully managed. The king became an expert in genealogy, not from scholarly interest, but from political necessity, understanding how bloodlines connected to power structures throughout his realm. The king's own relationships with individual nobles required constant attention and careful cultivation. A lord's injured pride could transform a loyal supporter into a dangerous enemy, while excessive royal favor toward particular families could provoke jealousy among others. The king must remember not just names and faces, but family histories, regional interests, current grievances, and personal ambitions among dozens of powerful families. Consider the exhausting mental exercise of maintaining these relationships while pursuing broader royal policies that might conflict with particular noble interests. A king who sought to strengthen royal justice might threaten noble autonomy. One who tried to increase royal revenues might challenge traditional noble tax exemptions. One who pursued foreign alliances might conflict with noble preferences based on regional considerations. Picture the royal court, where these complex relationships played out daily in countless small interactions. The king's choice of dining companions, his distribution of ceremonial roles, his allocation of royal patronage, all carried political messages that reverberated throughout the kingdom. Noble satisfaction with royal favor influenced their willingness to support crown policies, while noble discontent could crystallize into organized opposition that threatened dynastic survival. The king lived with constant awareness that his noble supporters were also his most dangerous potential enemies. Historical precedent showed how quickly loyal lords could transform into rebellion leaders when circumstances changed. Royal policies that seemed wise in one context might appear tyrannical in another. Loyal nobles might become dangerous rivals if their interests shifted, and today's strongest supporters could become tomorrow's greatest threats. Let us turn now to examine the medieval king's relationship with the common people of his realm, those millions of subjects whose lives were affected by royal decisions but who had no direct voice in royal policy. Picture a medieval village where news of royal proclamations arrives through traveling merchants, where royal justice appears in the form of circuit judges, where royal taxation manifests as additional burdens on already difficult lives. The king's connection to his common subjects was largely theoretical rather than practical. Royal policies affected peasant farmers, urban craftsmen, and rural laborers in profound ways. But these people had no mechanisms for communicating their needs or concerns directly to royal attention. The king might genuinely care about their welfare, but his understanding of their lives came through intermediaries who had their own interests in how information was presented. Royal taxation created the most direct interaction between crown and commons, but this relationship was largely extractive rather than reciprocal. The king needed revenue to fund military campaigns, court expenses, and administrative costs. But the burden of these taxes fell most heavily on those least able to bear them. Peasant farmers who barely survived subsistence agriculture were expected to contribute portions of their meager harvests to royal coffers, while urban workers faced taxes on their trades and transactions. The king's reputation among commoners depended largely on the behavior of royal officials who collected taxes, administered justice, and enforced royal law throughout the kingdom. Corrupt sheriffs, abusive tax collectors, and unjust judges could destroy royal legitimacy among common people, even when the king himself remained unaware of their misconduct. The king's authority was only as good as the integrity of his representatives. But controlling official behavior across vast medieval kingdoms was nearly impossible. Popular rebellions created particularly difficult challenges for medieval kings because they represented not organized political opposition, but genuine desperation among people who had exhausted all other options. Picture the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when common anger about taxation and social conditions exploded into violence that threatened the very foundations of royal authority. Such uprisings could not be resolved through normal political negotiation, but required either substantial policy changes or brutal military suppression. The king's response to popular unrest influenced his historical reputation for generations. Harsh suppression might restore immediate order, but could create lasting resentment that undermined long-term stability. Concessions to rebel demands might prevent immediate violence, but could encourage future uprisings by demonstrating that royal policies could be changed through popular pressure. Consider the moral complexity of royal decisions that affected millions of anonymous subjects. Military campaigns fought to maintain royal prestige, or territorial claims resulted in higher taxes, disrupted trade, and increased banditry that made ordinary life more difficult and dangerous. Diplomatic policies that seemed wise from a strategic perspective might have devastating consequences for border communities that bore the brunt of resulting conflicts. The king's charitable activities provided some connection to common welfare, but these personal acts of royal generosity could never address the systematic problems that created widespread hardship. Royal alms might help particular individuals, but royal policies toward taxation, justice, and economic regulation had far greater impact on general living conditions throughout the kingdom. Picture the king reviewing reports from his sheriffs and bailiffs, trying to understand conditions in distant parts of his realm through the filtered perspectives of officials who had their own interests in how information was presented. The king might genuinely wish to govern in ways that promoted common welfare, but his understanding of ordinary life remained largely theoretical, based on second-hand accounts that might be incomplete or deliberately misleading. The psychological burden of ruling millions of people whose individual stories remained unknown to royal attention created another dimension of royal isolation. The king's decisions affected countless lives in ways he would never fully understand, creating responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond his direct knowledge or control. Now let us explore the medieval king's relationship with death, that constant companion that shadowed every royal decision and gave urgency to every dynastic choice. Picture King Henry I losing his heir in the White Ship disaster, understanding in that moment that his entire life's work in building royal authority might die with him, leaving his kingdom vulnerable to civil war and foreign invasion. Medieval kings lived with constant awareness of mortality in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. Life expectancy was short even for the wealthy, medical knowledge was primitive, and violent death was an ever-present possibility. Every military campaign might end in royal death on foreign battlefields. Every diplomatic mission might result in assassination by foreign enemies. Every domestic crisis might escalate into rebellion that claimed the king's life along with his throne. The question of royal succession dominated every king's thinking, because dynastic continuity was essential to political stability. A kingdom without clear succession arrangements faced almost inevitable civil war as rival claimants fought for control. The king must not only produce male heirs, but also prepare them for leadership, arrange their education, secure their legitimacy, and build political support for their eventual rule. But preparing sons for kingship created its own dangers. History was filled with examples of royal heirs who grew impatient waiting for their inheritance and challenged their father's authority through rebellion. The king must balance preparing his sons for leadership against the risk that premature ambition might tear the kingdom apart. Too much preparation created dangerous rivals, too little left unprepared heirs, vulnerable to challenges after their accession. The king's own death became a matter of state planning rather than simply personal concern. Royal wills required careful construction to minimize succession disputes. Royal funeral arrangements needed to project continuing dynastic authority, and royal deathbed scenes became political theater designed to ensure smooth transitions. Even dying required political calculation and public performance. Consider the loneliness of facing mortality while surrounded by people whose primary concern was their own position in the coming reign. Royal deathbeds were crowded with nobles, clergy, and courtiers who came not to offer comfort, but to position themselves advantageously for the transition. The dying king's words were recorded for their political implications rather than their human meaning. His final decisions scrutinized for their impact on future stability rather than their reflection of personal values. The king's awareness of historical judgment added another dimension to his relationship with mortality. Unlike ordinary people who might hope to be remembered fondly by family and friends, kings knew their reigns would be evaluated by posterity based on political success and failure. Personal virtues and private kindnesses would be forgotten, while public mistakes would be recorded and criticized by future generations. Picture the king in his final illness, reviewing the accomplishments and failures of his reign, understanding that history would judge him not by his intentions, but by his results. The crown that once seemed to offer immortal glory revealed itself as a burden that would be evaluated long after its bearer had returned to dust. Royal legacy became another form of responsibility that extended beyond death itself. The king's funeral became the kingdom's statement about dynastic continuity and political stability. Royal ceremonies needed to project confidence in the succession while demonstrating the realm's continued strength. Every detail of royal burial, From the location of interment to the distribution of funeral honors, carried political messages that influenced the new reign's initial reception. Yet beneath all this political calculation lay the simple human reality of mortal fear and spiritual uncertainty. The medieval king faced death with the same fundamental questions that troubled all humans, but his public role prevented him from seeking comfort or expressing doubt in normal ways. His mortality remained largely private, hidden behind the eternal facade of royal authority that could never acknowledge weakness or uncertainty. As our gentle journey through the shadows of medieval kingship draws toward its peaceful conclusion, let us take a moment to reflect on the profound human cost of supreme power. We have walked together through the golden halls of royal palaces and discovered that they were often gilded prisons, explored the magnificent ceremonies of kingship, and found them to be elaborate performances that concealed deep loneliness and constant anxiety. These medieval kings, despite their wealth, authority, and historical prominence, lived lives constrained by responsibilities that would crush most ordinary people. Every dawn brought decisions that could affect thousands of lives. Every sunset left behind choices that might be evaluated and criticized for centuries. The crown that seemed to offer ultimate freedom instead created obligations that enslaved its wearers to duties they could never escape. Their daily existence was a careful performance where authenticity became not just impossible, but potentially dangerous. Royal emotions had to be controlled, royal preferences subordinated to political necessity, royal relationships evaluated for their strategic value rather than their personal meaning. The king lived constantly in public view, his every gesture analyzed for political significance, his private moments invaded by the demands of statecraft. The isolation of medieval kingship was perhaps its cruelest burden. Surrounded by hundreds of courtiers, advisors, and servants, the king remained fundamentally alone with responsibilities that could not be shared and decisions that could not be delegated. Trust became almost impossible when everyone possessed ulterior motives, friendship was subordinated to political advantage, and even family relationships were shaped by dynastic necessity rather than natural affection. Yet in understanding these burdens, we gain insight into the true nature of power and responsibility. The medieval king's story reminds us that positions of ultimate authority often demand the sacrifice of simple human pleasures that ordinary people take for granted. The freedom to make personal choices, the luxury of authentic relationships, the comfort of privacy and spontaneity. Consider how these long-ago struggles illuminate timeless truths about leadership and human nature. The weight of others' expectations, the loneliness of making difficult decisions, the burden of constant public scrutiny. These challenges face leaders in every age, though perhaps never as intensely as they pressed upon medieval kings who literally held the power of life and death over their subjects. The stone castles where these monarchs once lay awake with worry have crumbled into romantic ruins. Their political struggles have faded into historical curiosity. Their urgent decisions have become scholarly debates. But the essential human experiences they endured, responsibility, isolation, the weight of others' expectations, remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. As you settle more deeply into rest tonight, carry with you this gentle understanding of how the pursuit of power can transform golden opportunities into burdens heavier than stone. Let the knowledge of these ancient struggles remind you to appreciate the precious freedoms you possess, the ability to make choices based on personal desire rather than political calculation, to form relationships based on genuine affection rather than strategic advantage, to live authentically rather than constantly performing for others' expectations. The medieval world grows dim now, like candlelight fading in ancient chambers, its urgent politics becoming distant whispers that can no longer disturb your peace. The kings and queens who once ruled with such anxiety have found their final rest. Their crowns returned to dust, their struggles transformed into gentle lessons about the complexity of power and the value of simple human freedom. Sleep now with the quiet wisdom that comes from understanding how heavy crowns can be, how lonely thrones often are, how the apparent glory of ultimate power frequently conceals profound human cost. Let these stories of medieval monarchy drift through your dreams like distant echoes from castle halls, where the powerful once paced in sleepless worry, their golden crowns growing heavier with each passing year. Rest peacefully, knowing that your choices are genuinely your own, your relationships authentically meaningful, your burdens lighter than those carried by the monarchs of ages past. The weight of medieval kingship has dissolved into historical memory, leaving you free to dream of simpler times and gentler responsibilities, carried safely into sleep by the understanding that true freedom lies not in commanding others, but in being genuinely oneself. The last candle flickers out in the royal chambers of memory, the heavy doors of history close softly behind us, and the burdens of medieval kingship fade into the peaceful darkness where all earthly concerns find their rest. Sleep well, dear listener, cradled by the gentle knowledge that the heaviest crowns are worn by those who seem to have everything but possess very little of what truly matters for human happiness.